The MCU would start off pretty much the exact same in 2008 with Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, which would pretty much both be the exact same. However, things would change in 2009 when we would get an additional movie added to Phase 1, which would be Ant-Man. Ant-Man would follow Hank Pym as he takes up a job as a scientist at Advanced Idea Mechanics, working under George Tarleton. There, he meets Janet Van Dyne, who he begins to form a relationship with, discovers the Pym particles, and takes up the identity of the hero Ant-Man. Eventually, George Tarleton becomes intrigued by these Pym particles and tries to utilize them for himself, but ends up accidentally being turned into MODOK. Blaming Hank for this, he seeks revenge on him. During the third act, he kidnaps Janet, and so Hank has to stop him. MODOK is ultimately defeated, but not killed. And post-credit scene, it's revealed that Hank created a suit for Janet, who's now going by the Wasp. In 2010, we would get 4, which is pretty much just the exact same movie, with the exception of Hawkeye being swapped out for just some random S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. In 2011, we would get both Iron Man 2 and Captain America the First Avenger. Iron Man 2 follows pretty much the exact same plot, however Hank Pym would have a cameo, and Black Widow's role would be replaced by Mockingbird, albeit to a much smaller extent. Meanwhile, Captain America the First Avenger would be pretty much the exact same movie. This would of course lead us into the Avengers, which would be pretty much the exact same movie, albeit just with Ant-Man and the Wasp taking the place of Black Widow and Hawkeye. There would also be a post-credit scene where we see Hank beginning to work on Ultron. Phase 2 would still begin with Iron Man 3 in 2013, but it would be a very different film. AIM's role would be completely replaced with Ezekiel Stane as the secondary antagonist. He wants revenge on Tony for the death of his father, so he teamed up with the Mandarin, played by Ben Kingsley, to try and ruin Tony's life. Things go pretty much the exact same up until the third act, where Tony has to fight against Ezekiel, who is wearing an upgraded version of his father's Ironmonger armor. Tony manages to defeat Ironmonger, while it's also revealed that this Mandarin is not the actual Mandarin, but is instead some disgraced Shakespearean actor named Trevor Slattery, who uses high-tech rings that he claims to be of alien origin. Ultimately, Ezekiel dies, and Trevor Slattery is taken into custody, but Tony doesn't retire or anything because he manages to convince Pepper that the world still needs Iron Man. Also, there would be a post-credit scene setting up that there is indeed a real Mandarin. The first big change of Phase 2 would be that instead of For the Dark World coming out in 2013, it would be Ant-Man and the Wasp. This film would follow pretty much the exact same plot as the Black Alliance version, which I will link in the description. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. For Journey into Mystery would be a very different film compared to For the Dark World. The plot of this movie would see Thor go up against Enchantress and Executioner. The Reality Stone would still be involved, much like in For the Dark World. However, overall, this would be a very different movie. Captain America the Winter Soldier would be pretty much the exact same movie, the only difference being that Alexander Pierce would be completely replaced by Baron Helmut Zemo. This would lead to the second Avengers movie, Avengers Under Siege, to feature the Masters of Evil comprised of Baron Zemo, Crimson Dynamo, Enchantress and Executioner, Abomination, Taskmaster, Swordsman, Ghost, Whirlwind, and Black Knight. Swordsman and Black Knight would ultimately turn against the Masters of Evil. During the third act, the Avengers would somehow be overpowered, and so Hank would bring out the newly completed Ultron. However, Ultron starts malfunctioning and ends up killing a few members of the Masters, but he's thankfully shut down. Did I mention the Imagines of Circus would be a part of this? No? Okay. Anyways, the plot of the first film would be a combination of the pilot and episode 2. Pomni arrives at the circus, and the first half kind of introduces us to the rest of the cast. And they go on an adventure from episode 2, and things mostly go the same, until the climax, when the abstracted Kaufmo manages to make his way into the Candy Kingdom and starts attacking everything. Gamegu fights him back till Kane can banish him. However, in the process, he ends up being killed. That's basically it. Phase 3 would still begin with Captain America Civil War, however, it would be a bit of a different film. Instead of Baron Zemo being the big mastermind, it would be MODOK, returning from the first Ant-Man film. After the events of that first Ant-Man film, MODOK and AIM kind of went underground. They did a couple experiments which created a few metahumans, including Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, Wonder Man, and Grim Reaper. Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Wonder Man eventually turn on AIM and join up with Cap, while Grim Reaper ends up dying. Overall, it's a pretty much the exact same film, just with AIM having a very large role on the plot. Doctor Strange would be pretty much the exact same movie, with the only difference being that obviously there wouldn't be the Time Stone. The Eye of Agamotto does sort of more or less still have control over time though, so we don't really have to change the ending where Strange puts Dormammu into an endless time loop. The first entirely new project of Phase 3 would be Ghost Rider. This film would follow the origin story of Ronnie Reyes' Ghost Rider, with Zadkiel as the main villain. Spider-Man Homecoming would pretty much be the exact same movie, the only difference being that rather than Vulture using Chitauri tech, it would use tech developed by AIM. Thor Ragnarok pretty much follows the exact same plot. However, the only massive difference is the post-credit scene being changed. You see, in this post-credit scene, we would actually see Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne working on a device that allows them to travel into a realm known as the Microverse. However, something happens and they get sucked up into a computer. I know it sounds weird, but we'll get to that eventually. Black Panther is pretty much just the same film, but there is a post-credit scene that reveals that some vibranium was mysteriously stolen from Wakanda by weird robots. Probably guess what that's leading to. Giant Man the Wasp Circus Mania will be the precursor to the big crossover film. Scott Lang, currently Ant-Man, discovers that Hank and Janet have mysteriously gone missing. So he ends up traveling into the Microverse, thinking he'll find them there. Meanwhile, Hank and Janet end up at the circus, and while they try to find a way out, they're being involved in the adventure from episode 3. However, little do they know that after the events of Avengers Under Siege, Ultron actually uploaded his consciousness into the mainframe of the circus itself, and is planning on using it as a way to build power. Eventually, Scott ends up making it to the circus somehow, and Ultron ends up basically sucking Kane's power out and using it to escape into the physical realm. Hank, Janet, Scott, and the rest of the circus gang are able to chase after him. However, Ultron ends up kidnapping Ragatha and plans on making her into his bride. You can probably tell what that means if you've read the comics. Finally, we get to the big crossover film, or at least the first part of it, Avengers Age of Ultron. This will have a very similar plot to the Black Lions version from his version of What If Ultron was the villain of the first MCU saga. However, obviously there are going to be some differences to better fit this universe. First of all, while we still have Wonder Man, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, we don't have the rest of the Defenders like Tigra, Rocket Raccoon, and Machine Man. And also, of course, the Circus Gang are there. Other than that, and a couple small tweaks, it's pretty much the exact same film and still ends with the cliffhanger ending of Ultron basically leaving Earth in an apocalyptic state with half of the heroes dead. The precursor to the finale to this first saga would be Captain Marvel, which is pretty much just the exact same movie. However, it stands out a bit more since this is the first film to truly explore the cosmic side of the Marvel Universe. So, yeah. Finally, we get Avengers Endgame, which, much like Age of Ultron, will follow similar plots of Black Lion version, but with a lot of changes. The basic plot, however, is basically the same. Doctor Strange manages to summon the surviving heroes. Camartage. This also includes Captain Marvel and Robbie Reyes Ghost Rider. And after getting rid of Vision and surviving Ultron drones, Hank, about a year after all this takes place, discovers that time works differently in the microverse, as he uses it, alongside some of the code from the Digital Circus, to construct a time machine that will allow the survivors to go back in time, make subtle changes to the timeline, so they can stop Ultron's plan from coming true. They succeed, however, because of some stuff involving Jocasta, this doesn't actually stop Ultron's plan, it just simply delays it. Thankfully, Doctor Strange, who got a magical letter from Hank, ends up opening portals to summon all the heroes, and together they take on Ultron and manage to destroy him. Hank ends up sacrificing his life, however, and Janet retires, passing down the Wasp mantle to her niece Hope, who alongside Scott are the new Ant-Man and the Wasp. Cap goes back in time and passes down the Captain America mantle to Sam. Tony retires to be a father to his daughter, and overall, things are just much happier. Spider-Man Far From Home would still be the epilogue to the saga. However, there'd also be a lot of changes, especially since Tony's still alive, so a lot of things, including the name of Edith, would have to be changed. Also, Amadeus Cho would be featured in this film, and he'd be gifted the Iron Spider suit by Peter at the end, because Peter doesn't really feel like he needs it anymore. But that's the same film.